I was limping down the side of a country road with my 8-month-old daughter in my arms when a black pickup truck slowed beside me. The driver rolled down the window, and my stomach dropped. It was my dad. We hadn't spoken much in years. He looked from my swollen ankle to the baby, then scanned the empty road behind me. "Where's your car?" I swallowed hard. My mother-in-law took it. His face darkened. "Why?" I hesitated. She said I was getting too independent. Dad went silent. Then he unlocked the door. "Get in. This ends tonight." If someone had told me 3 years earlier that I would one day be walking down a roadside with a baby in my arms and nowhere to go, I would have laughed. Back then, my life looked normal. I was married to Ethan, a quiet, hardworking man I'd met during my final year of college. He wasn't flashy or overly romantic, but he made me feel safe. We dated for 3 years, got married, and eventually welcomed our daughter, Sophie. For a while, everything seemed fine. The only challenge was Ethan's mother, Carol. When we first married, Carol appeared loving and generous. She brought meals when I was busy, helped decorate our home, and constantly reminded everyone how much she cared about family. People adored her. I did too, at least in the beginning. The first warning signs were so small that I barely noticed them. Carol always had an opinion. She had opinions about our furniture, our finances, our vacations, even what color we painted the nursery. Whenever I disagreed, she'd smile politely and say, "I'm only trying to help." Ethan usually agreed with her. Not because he wanted to upset me. It was simply easier. Carol had spent his entire life convincing him she always knew best. After Sophie was born, things became worse. Carol started showing up unannounced. Sometimes she'd walk into the house carrying groceries and immediately begin rearranging things. Other times, she'd take Sophie from my arms before even saying hello. If I objected, she'd act offended. "I'm her grandmother," she would say. As months passed, her influence seemed to grow. She knew our schedules. She knew our passwords. She knew details about our finances that I never remembered sharing. The strangest part was how normal everyone treated it. Whenever I mentioned feeling uncomfortable, Ethan would shrug. "That's just Mom." Those 3 words became the answer to everything. That's just Mom. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment everything started. Because Carol wasn't helping. She was slowly taking control. And none of us stopped her. The older Sophie got, the more involved Carol became. At first, I told myself I was being sensitive. After all, plenty of grandparents loved being active in their grandchildren's lives. But Carol wasn't simply involved. She was inserting herself into every decision. When Sophie was 6 months old, I switched her to a different baby formula after speaking with our pediatrician. The next day, Carol arrived carrying 3 containers of the old brand. "You shouldn't change things without consulting family," she said. I reminded her that Sophie was my daughter. Carol laughed as if I'd made a cute joke. When I started preparing homemade baby food, she criticized my recipes. When I bought new clothes for Sophie, she returned some of them and purchased replacements. Sometimes she would even change plans I'd already made. The most frustrating part was Ethan. No matter what happened, he always found a way to defend her. "Mom means well. Mom is just trying to help. Mom has experience." I heard those sentences, so often they began sounding like background noise. Gradually, Carol's involvement expanded beyond parenting. She started commenting on my daily routine. Why was I taking Sophie to that playground? Why did I visit that grocery store? Why did I spend so much time outside the house? Then came the financial questions. Carol wanted to know what I spent each month. She asked about savings, credit cards, insurance. At first, I answered politely. Then I realized she wasn't making conversation. She was collecting information. One afternoon, I walked into my kitchen and found Carol scrolling through a family budget spreadsheet on Ethan's laptop. I stared at her in disbelief. She didn't even look embarrassed. I was just checking that everything looked responsible. Responsible, as if she were the parent and I was the child. The strangest thing was how confident she became, almost as though she believed she had authority over our household. By then, I was beginning to lose confidence in myself. Every decision seemed to attract criticism. Every choice required approval. Every disagreement became a lecture. Then one evening, while watching me place my car keys on the counter, Carol smiled and said something that made my stomach tighten. "You know, dear, you're becoming far too dependent on that car." After Carol made that comment about my car, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was another one of her strange opinions. Maybe I was overthinking it. But over the following weeks, she kept bringing it up. Every chance she got. If I took Sophie to a playgroup across town, Carol would ask why I needed to drive so far. If I visited a friend, she'd want to know how long I'd been gone. If I stopped by a store on the way home, somehow Carol already knew. At first, I couldn't figure out how. Then, I discovered Ethan had been casually sharing details of our schedules with her for years. Not because she needed the information, simply because she asked. One evening during dinner, Carol looked at me and said, "When I was raising children, mothers stayed home more. They weren't constantly running around." I set down my fork. "I only go where I need to go." She smiled. "Of course you do." The way she said it made my skin crawl. A few days later, she called while I was driving. When I didn't answer, she immediately called Ethan. By the time I got home, he was waiting. "Mom was worried. Why didn't you pick up?" I stared at him. "I was driving." "Well, maybe send a quick text next time." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was a grown woman being questioned for missing a phone call. From that point on, the comments became more frequent. Carol started referring to my car as though it were a problem, a distraction, an unhealthy influence. She claimed I spent too much time outside the house, too much time with friends, too much time making decisions without consulting family. The word family always meant one thing: Carol. Then one afternoon, while Sophie napped in her stroller, I overheard a conversation between Carol and Ethan in our kitchen. They didn't know I was standing in the hallway. "She relies on that car too much," Carol said. Ethan sighed. "I know. Something needs to change." There was a long silence. Then Ethan quietly replied, "Maybe you're right." A cold feeling settled in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't worried about Carol. I was worried about what she might convince my husband to do next. The morning my car disappeared started like any other. I woke up at 6, fed Sophie breakfast, packed her diaper bag, and got ready for a pediatrician appointment across town. Nothing seemed unusual until I looked out the front window. My driveway was empty. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I blinked twice, looked again. Still empty. My car was gone. I rushed outside carrying Sophie on my hip. The driveway, the curb, the street. Nothing. A knot formed in my stomach. Had it been stolen? I pulled out my phone and called Ethan immediately. He answered after 2 rings. "Hey. My car is gone." There was a pause. A strange pause. Not surprised. Not confused. Just quiet. Then he said, "I know." My heart dropped. "You know, Mom has it." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "What do you mean Mom has it?" "She borrowed it." "Borrowed it?" I nearly shouted. "Without asking me?" Ethan sighed. "Can you please stay calm?" "Stay calm." The words felt unreal. "Why does your mother have my car?" Another pause. Then he said something that changed everything. "She thinks you've become too dependent on it." I honestly thought I had misheard him. Dependent on my own car? "Mom believes you've been making too many decisions without considering the family." The family. There it was again. Carol's favorite word. I felt anger rising through every part of me. "So, your solution was to let her take my vehicle? It isn't permanent." I laughed. A sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Where is she?" "At her house." I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. 20 minutes later, I was standing in Carol's living room. She sat comfortably in her favorite chair, drinking coffee. My keys rested on the table beside her, as if they belonged there. "I want my car back." She smiled calmly. "No." I stared at her. "No. You need boundaries, dear. It's my car." "No," she replied. "It's a privilege you've abused." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then she folded her hands and delivered the sentence I'll never forget. "You'll get it back when you've learned respect." At that moment, I realized this wasn't about a car. It was about control. And Carol thought she'd already won. The next few days felt like living under house arrest. Without my car, even simple tasks became difficult. Sophie's pediatrician appointment had to be canceled. A grocery trip required coordinating rides. Every errand became a negotiation. Every plan depended on someone else's permission. The worst part was knowing none of it had happened by accident. Carol had designed it that way. She wanted me dependent. She wanted me asking for help. And she wanted everyone to see that she controlled the solution. Whenever I needed transportation, Carol somehow found out. If Ethan drove me somewhere, she'd call him afterward. If a friend offered help, she'd ask questions about where I'd gone. What should have been temporary quickly became humiliating. One afternoon, I needed diapers and baby medicine. I called Ethan at work. "Can you pick them up on your way home?" There was a pause. Then he said, "Why don't you ask Mom? She's available." I closed my eyes. Of course. Everything led back to Carol. That evening, she arrived carrying shopping bags and wearing a satisfied smile. "You see," she said while unloading supplies onto the counter. "Family takes care of family." I thanked her because I needed the items. But inside, I felt something breaking. A few days later, I asked again for my car. Carol laughed. Actually laughed. "I don't think you're ready yet." Ready. As though I were a teenager grounded for bad behavior. Not a wife. Not a mother. Not an adult. Even Ethan seemed uncomfortable by then, but he still refused to challenge her. Every conversation ended the same way. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." But it was already bigger. Much bigger. Because the car wasn't a real issue anymore. The issue was that my husband had allowed someone else to take away my independence. And he expected me to accept it. That realization changed everything. Instead of arguing, I started paying attention. I saved text messages, recorded dates, documented conversations. Every comment, every threat disguised as advice, every excuse. If nobody else could see what was happening, I would make sure I had proof. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of control returning. And deep down, I knew something important. I couldn't keep living like this. Sooner or later, something had to give. The confrontation finally happened on a Sunday afternoon. Carol had invited several relatives to her house for what she called a simple family lunch. By then, I was exhausted. 3 weeks had passed since she had taken my car. 3 weeks of excuses. 3 weeks of humiliation. And 3 weeks of Ethan pretending the situation was normal. I told myself I would stay quiet. I lasted 20 minutes. Everyone was gathered around the dining table when Carol started talking about responsibility. At first, the comments were general. Then she looked directly at me. "Some people need guidance before they make good decisions." A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. My stomach tightened. I set down my glass. "Can we stop pretending this is normal?" The room immediately went silent. Carol tilted her head. "What do you mean, dear?" I looked directly at her. "I mean my car." A few people exchanged confused glances. Carol's smile faded slightly. "Oh, that again." "Yes, that again." The tension became thick enough to feel. I turned toward Ethan. "Tell them." His eyes widened. "Tell them your mother took my vehicle and refuses to return it." Nobody spoke. Several relatives looked genuinely shocked. Carol crossed her arms. "You're being dramatic." Dramatic. I could hear my voice shaking. "You took my property because you wanted control over my life." Carol stood up. "I took action because someone had to." The words hit me like a slap. Someone had to. As if I were incapable of managing my own life. I looked around the room. Nobody was defending me. Nobody was saying this was wrong. Most of them simply looked uncomfortable. Then I looked at Ethan. "Say something." He stared at the table. "Maybe this isn't the place." That was it. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not because of Carol. Because of him. My husband had watched all of this happen and chosen silence. Again. And again. And again. I pushed my chair back. The sound echoed through the room. "I'm done." Carol laughed softly. "Done with what?" I picked up Sophie's diaper bag. Being controlled. Without another word, I lifted my daughter into my arms and headed for the door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. As I stepped outside, tears blurred my vision. For the first time, I truly understood something. If I wanted my life back, nobody was going to rescue me. I would have to start walking away myself. The moment I stepped off Carol's property, I had no plan. I just kept walking. Sophie rested against my shoulder, unaware that the foundation of my marriage had cracked wide open behind us. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as I followed the narrow road leading away from the neighborhood. At first, my anger carried me forward. Every step felt fueled by weeks of frustration. Carol's smirks, Ethan's excuses, the endless lectures disguised as concern. They replayed through my mind like a broken recording. After 20 minutes, the adrenaline began to fade. Reality took its place. I had no car, no destination, and no idea what I was going to do next. I shifted Sophie higher in my arms and kept moving. A few cars passed. None stopped. The road stretched ahead in both directions, quiet except for the occasional rush of traffic. For the first time all day, I felt completely alone. Not lonely. Alone. There was a difference. Loneliness meant missing someone. This was the realization that nobody was coming to help. Not my husband. Not my mother-in-law. Not anyone. About 40 minutes into the walk, my foot landed awkwardly on the edge of a cracked section of pavement. Pain shot through my ankle. I stumbled and nearly lost my balance. A sharp gasp escaped my lips. The pain didn't disappear. It grew worse with every step. I sat on a grassy shoulder beside the road and carefully adjusted Sophie. My ankle was already swelling.
Great.
Just great. I stared at the traffic moving in the distance and felt tears threatening again. How had my life become this? A year earlier, I had believed I was building a future. Now I was sitting beside a road with an injured ankle, carrying a baby, trapped in a marriage where other people made decisions about my freedom. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Then I forced myself back to my feet. One painful step at a time, I continued walking. The sun was beginning to dip lower when I heard the sound of an engine slowing behind me. A black pickup truck pulled onto the shoulder. I turned toward it. The driver's window rolled down, and the moment I saw who was behind the wheel, I froze. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. The man behind the wheel was my father. Dad and I had never been completely estranged, but we weren't especially close either. Life had pulled us in different directions over the years. We exchanged holiday calls, occasional visits, and birthday messages. Nothing more. Yet there he was, staring at me from behind the wheel of his black pickup. His eyes immediately moved from my face to Sophie, then to my swollen ankle, then back to me. The expression on his face changed instantly. Diana? Just hearing my name in his voice nearly broke me. I swallowed hard. Hi, Dad. He parked fully on the shoulder and stepped out. The closer he got, the more concerned he looked. What happened to your ankle? I shook my head. It's a long story. He looked down the empty road behind me, then back at me. Where's your car? The question hit harder than I expected. For a second, I couldn't answer, because saying it out loud made it sound even more ridiculous. My mother-in-law took it. Dad blinked once.
What?
She took my car. His forehead creased. Took it where? To her house. Why? I looked away. Because even now, I felt embarrassed. Because normal adults didn't have to explain things like this. Finally, I forced the words out. She said I was becoming too independent. The silence that followed felt endless.
Dad didn't speak.
Didn't move. Didn't blink. He simply stared at me. Then he looked at Sophie sleeping peacefully against my shoulder. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Your husband allowed this? I nodded. His face darkened. Not explosive anger. Something colder. Something far more serious. For years, I'd known my father as a calm man. A patient man. The kind of person who rarely raised his voice. But I could see something changing behind his eyes. He took a slow breath. Then another. Finally, he opened the passenger door of the truck. Get in. I hesitated. Dad, I don't want to cause trouble. He gave me a look I'd only seen a handful of times in my life. The look that meant his mind was made up. This stopped being trouble a long time ago.
He pointed toward the seat.
Get in. I climbed into the truck. Dad closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and started the engine. Then he looked straight ahead and said quietly, "This ends tonight." Dad didn't drive me back to my house. Instead, he took me to his place. The same small brick home where I'd grown up. The same driveway where he taught me how to ride a bike and later how to drive my first car. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had taught me independence was now helping me recover it. Once inside, he helped settle Sophie into a spare bedroom and handed me a glass of water. Then, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. Start from the beginning. For the next hour, I told him everything. Not just about the car. Everything. Carol's constant interference. The criticism. The control. The financial questions. The way Ethan always defended her. The day my car disappeared. The family lunch. The walk down the road. Dad listened without interrupting. The only sound in the room was the occasional ticking of the kitchen clock. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. His expression remained calm, but I could see the anger underneath. The kind that came from hearing someone hurt a person he loved. "Do you have proof?" he asked. I nodded. More proof than I realized. I opened my phone. Text messages. Emails. Photos. Notes I'd been documenting for weeks. One by one, Dad reviewed them. His jaw tightened with every screen. At one point, he read a message from Carol that said, "You'll get the car back when you're ready to behave responsibly." He stared at it for several seconds, then quietly set the phone down. That's not concern.
No.
That's control. I nodded. For the first time in weeks, someone else was finally saying it out loud. Dad spent another half hour reviewing everything. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table. This is worse than I thought. The words sent a chill through me. What do you mean? He looked directly at me. I think they've become so comfortable controlling you that they don't even realize how wrong this is anymore. The room fell silent. Then Dad reached for his phone. Who are you calling? I asked. A few people.
His tone was calm. Too calm.
The kind of calm that usually appeared right before something important happened. As he began scrolling through his contacts, a strange feeling settled over me. For the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't afraid. I was curious. Because whatever Dad was planning, he already seemed 3 steps ahead. The next morning, I woke up expecting uncertainty. Instead, I found Dad already sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a cup of coffee, and several pages of notes spread out in front of him. It looked less like breakfast and more like preparation.
"Morning," he said.
I sat down slowly. "You've been busy." He nodded. Very. During the night, he'd made several phone calls. One had been to an attorney he'd known for years. Another had been to a retired judge who occasionally consulted on family disputes. A third had been to an old friend who worked in vehicle registration. I stared at him. "You did all that?" Dad shrugged. I wanted facts. For the next hour, he walked me through everything he had learned. The first surprise involved my car. Although Ethan had contributed to some household expenses over the years, the vehicle itself was registered solely in my name. Every payment, every insurance document, every registration record.
Mine.
Dad slid a copy of the information across the table. Legally, nobody had the right to take it from you. A strange mixture of relief and anger washed through me. I had known it felt wrong. Now I knew it actually was wrong. Then Dad showed me something else. A timeline. Every documented incident I'd recorded. Every text message. Every demand. Every attempt to control my decisions. Seeing everything organized on paper was unsettling. The pattern became impossible to ignore. What had felt like isolated events suddenly looked deliberate. Systematic. Calculated. Dad tapped the stack of papers. This isn't about one car. I know. It's about authority. I nodded. For the first time, I understood the situation exactly as he did. Carol wasn't trying to help. She was trying to establish power. And Ethan had allowed it to happen. Dad leaned back in his chair. I also spoke with the attorney. My stomach tightened. What did he say? He said people like Carol usually believe nobody will challenge them. The room grew quiet. Then Dad smiled slightly. Not a happy smile. A confident one. The attorney would like to meet tomorrow. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. I looked at the organized files covering the table. For weeks, I'd felt trapped and powerless. Now things were moving.
Fast.
As Dad gathered the documents into a folder, I finally asked the question lingering in my mind. What happens next? He closed the folder and stood. Tomorrow, he said, we make sure everyone understands the rules have changed. The meeting took place the following afternoon. Dad had arranged it carefully. No surprises. No ambushes. Everyone knew they were expected to attend. That included Carol,
Ethan,
and several close family members who had witnessed pieces of the situation over the previous weeks. We met in a private conference room at the attorney's office. The moment Carol walked in, I knew she wasn't worried. She carried herself with the same confidence she'd always had. The confidence of someone who had spent years getting her way. Ethan followed behind her looking nervous. When they saw me sitting beside Dad, both hesitated. Carol recovered first. This seems a little dramatic. Dad didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the empty chairs. Please sit. Something about his tone made even Carol obey. The attorney sat quietly at one end of the table while everyone settled in. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Carol folded her arms. Can someone explain why we're here? Dad opened a folder. Certainly. His voice remained calm, controlled, professional. We're here because Diana's vehicle was taken without permission. Carol rolled her eyes. Oh, not this again. Dad continued, as though she hadn't spoken. The vehicle is legally registered solely in Diana's name. He slid copies of the registration documents across the table. Carol's confidence faltered slightly. It's still family property. No, the attorney said quietly. It isn't. The room went silent. Dad placed another stack of papers on the table. Text messages.
dates,
Documented incidents. A complete timeline. One by one, he walked everyone through them. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended Carol. As the evidence accumulated, the atmosphere began changing. Family members who had previously stayed silent started exchanging uncomfortable looks. Even Ethan appeared shaken. Finally, Dad looked directly at him. Did you know the vehicle belonged solely to your wife? Ethan swallowed. Yes. And you still allowed your mother to take it? His silence answered the question. For the first time since entering the room, Carol looked uncertain. The balance of power was shifting. She could feel it. Everyone could. Dad closed the folder and folded his hands. We're not here to argue. Carol shifted in her seat. Then what are we here for? Dad met her gaze, without blinking. We're here because your control over Diana ends today. For the first time all afternoon, Carol had no immediate response. And that terrified her far more than anger ever could. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Carol sat rigidly in her chair, her confident smile gone. The silence felt different now. Earlier, people had been avoiding conflict. Now they were waiting for answers. Carol finally cleared her throat. You're making this sound far worse than it is. Dad remained calm. Then explain it. She opened her mouth.
closed it.
Opened it again. I was trying to help. The excuse sounded weak even to her. Dad slid another document across the table. It was a printed copy of one of her text messages. The one that said I would get my car back when I learned respect. Several relatives read it. Nobody looked impressed. Dad pointed toward the page. How is this helping? Carol hesitated. I was teaching responsibility. A voice suddenly spoke from the far end of the table. It was Ethan's aunt. No, Carol. That sounds like punishment. The room went still. Carol turned toward her in shock. Apparently, she hadn't expected anyone to challenge her. Then another relative spoke. I thought Diana agreed to all this.
So did I, someone else added.
One by one, people began sharing what they believed had happened. Most had been given a completely different version of events. Carol had told them she was temporarily helping. that I was overwhelmed, that I needed support. The truth sounded very different. As more details emerged, the narrative she had carefully built started collapsing. Then Dad asked the question nobody else had dared to ask. Why were you so determined to control her transportation? Carol looked away. For the first time, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. The attorney quietly waited. Everyone waited. Finally, Carol sighed. I was worried she was pulling away from the family. There it was. The real reason. Not safety. Not responsibility.
Control.
She wanted access. Influence.
Authority.
And my independence threatened all three. The confession changed everything. Because once it was spoken aloud, nobody could pretend otherwise. Dad looked at Ethan. What about you? Ethan stared at the table. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders dropped. I knew Mom was going too far. The room became silent again. I felt my heart sink.
Not because I was surprised.
Because hearing it confirmed my worst fear. He had known all along. And despite knowing it was wrong, he had chosen his mother's comfort over his wife's freedom. The meeting ended very differently than Carol had expected. When she arrived, she had assumed she would be defending a harmless decision. Instead, she left facing the consequences of her own actions. The first consequence came immediately. The attorney slid a document across the table and looked directly at Carol. Diana's vehicle must be returned today. Not tomorrow. Not next week.
Today.
Carol looked toward Ethan, as if expecting support. For the first time, it didn't come. He remained silent. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. The room had changed. People who once nodded along with her were now questioning her behavior. People who had trusted her version of events were seeing a different reality. And she had no one to blame except herself. An hour later, we drove to her house. Dad came with me. So did the attorney. When Carol handed over the keys, she did it without a word. No lecture. No conditions. No demands. Just silence. I wrapped my fingers around the keys and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not because of the vehicle itself. Because it represented something larger. My independence. My choices. My life. That evening, Ethan asked to speak privately. We sat on opposite sides of the living room. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. I didn't think it would go this far. I looked at him. It went this far because nobody stopped it. He lowered his eyes. For once, he didn't argue, didn't make excuses,
Didn't defend his mother.
He simply sat there facing the consequences of his own silence. Over the following weeks, new boundaries were established. Carol no longer had unrestricted access to our home. She no longer involved herself in personal decisions. And for the first time in years, people stopped treating her opinions as final authority. The biggest change, however, happened inside me. I stopped asking permission, stopped explaining every decision, stopped shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. The woman who had walked down that lonely road carrying her daughter was disappearing. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who finally understood her own worth. And with every passing day, I felt a little more free. For the first time in a very long time, the future belonged to me. The months that followed weren't easy. Getting my car back hadn't magically fixed everything. The damage caused by years of control didn't disappear overnight. Some wounds never do. For the first time, however, I wasn't facing those challenges alone. Dad checked in regularly. Not to tell me what to do. Not to manage my decisions. Just to remind me that support and control were not the same thing. That lesson changed more than I realized. At Dad's suggestion, I started meeting with a therapist. At first, I resisted. I told myself I wasn't the kind of person who needed therapy. But after a few sessions, I understood something important. I had spent years doubting myself. Years second-guessing simple decisions. Years allowing other people's opinions to carry more weight than my own. The therapist helped me recognize those patterns. More importantly, she helped me break them. Little by little, my confidence returned. I stopped apologizing for harmless choices. I stopped explaining every plan. I stopped feeling guilty for wanting independence. The changes were small at first. Then they became impossible to ignore. Friends noticed. Family noticed. Even I noticed. The woman staring back at me in the mirror seemed different. Stronger. Calmer. More certain of herself. My relationship with Ethan, however, remained complicated. He apologized repeatedly. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. But apologies couldn't erase years of silence. Trust takes a long time to build. It takes far less time to break. We spent months having difficult conversations. Some ended well. Others didn't. Yet regardless of where those conversations led, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow someone else's comfort to come before my freedom. Meanwhile, Sophie continued growing, laughing, learning, exploring the world with endless curiosity. Whenever I looked at her, I felt motivated to keep moving forward. She deserved a mother who knew her own worth. A mother who wasn't afraid to set boundaries. A mother who understood that love should never require surrendering control of your own life. One evening, while watching Sophie play in the living room, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the way I used to be. The hurt hadn't vanished completely, but the fear was gone. And in its place was something far more powerful. Confidence. The kind nobody could take away from me again. Almost a year passed before I fully understood how much my life had changed. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment when everything suddenly became perfect. Instead, it happened slowly. One decision at a time. One boundary at a time. One act of self-respect at a time. By then, Sophie was running through the house with endless energy, turning every room into her personal playground. The sound of her laughter filled spaces that had once felt heavy with tension. Now, those same rooms felt peaceful. Safe. Mine. My relationship with Ethan eventually reached a crossroads. For months, he worked to rebuild trust. He attended counseling. He accepted responsibility. And for the first time in his life, he began setting boundaries with Carol. Real boundaries. Not temporary compromises. Not empty promises. Actual boundaries. The process was difficult for him. Years of habits don't disappear overnight. But whether our future remained together or eventually followed separate paths, one thing became clear. I would never again accept a relationship where my voice came second. Carol struggled the most. For years, she had been accustomed to influencing every decision around her. Now, people challenged her, questioned her, pushed back. The control she had fought so hard to maintain was gone. Not because anyone punished her, because people finally stopped surrendering it. One Saturday afternoon, Dad and I sat on a bench overlooking a small lake near his house while Sophie chased ducks along the shoreline. The weather was perfect, the kind of day that makes you appreciate simple things. Dad watched Sophie for a moment before turning toward me. "You know," he said, "I worried about you." I smiled. "I know."
No.
I mean, really worried. His voice carried an honesty that caught me off guard. "I hated seeing you doubt yourself." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had stayed with me since the day he stopped his truck on that road. "Why did you get involved?" Dad laughed softly. "As a father?"
Yeah.
He looked out across the water. "Because nobody should have to earn the right to make decisions about their own life." The words settled deep inside me. Simple.
Honest. True.
We sat there quietly for a while, watching Sophie play. Finally, Dad stood and brushed off his jeans. "Ready to head home?" Home. The word made me smile, because now it meant something different. Not a place controlled by someone else's rules. Not a place filled with pressure and fear. A place built on respect.
Trust.
And freedom. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Sophie reached up and grabbed my hand. I squeezed hers gently. Years earlier, I had walked down a lonely road believing nobody was coming to help. I was wrong. Help had come. But more importantly, I had learned to help myself. And that changed everything. The car had never been the real victory. Getting my life back was.